Welcome back. Today we're going to talk corporate development with Robert. Robert, thank you so much for joining us.
Awesome. Great. Thanks, Scott. Good to be here.
So before we jump into kind of an industry overview of corporate development, I would love if you can talk a little bit about your background and ultimately what drew you to corporate development.
Sure. Yeah, more than happy to. So I went to University of Georgia for undergrad, majored in finance there, and then spent 5 years in banking in a corporate banking role. So not pure investment banking, but the role consisted of a lot of financial modeling, a lot of working through financial statements, financial analysis. So it was definitely heavy and had an experience on that side of it. The group I was at started to look to expand into healthcare and technology companies. And when I started to see those, became really interested in what they were doing, the way that those technologies would impact people, and realized too that I became much more interested in the more strategic thought behind what sort of financial decisions you make as opposed to just the financial structures themselves. So with that, I went to school with a fairly clear direction about trying to do corporate development within a technology or healthcare related company.
Awesome. Okay, and yeah, let's jump a little bit into corporate development. And I want to preface this a little bit by saying that in choosing what you want to do post-MBA, there's often the idea that you can kind of choose an industry or a function. And you were kind of meshing a function into two industries you were interested in. And depending on what industry you look at, that function could look different. So I just want people to be aware of that. Corporate development for tech and healthcare could look very different at the job role. But I would love for you to kind of lay out how you see corporate development kind of broadly, and maybe through a few examples of specifics of what that could look like in maybe a certain industry.
Yeah, of course. So it definitely varies a lot. It varies a lot company to company, and it varies a lot by industry. But I think it's probably most appropriate to start with industry. The way M&A is used varies in whether it's really more of a growth tool, or for some industries, you see it's a bit more of a consolidation as industries really go through shifts. And the industries in which it's used much more as a growth tool, let's think about those in which there's always developing, the easy word to say technologies, but just thinking about valuable resources that are developed externally. So that's where you see so many deals from the tech companies. That's why in biotech and pharma, medical device, it's a lot of bigger companies that are able to find small technologies in which, for the big tech companies, it's a couple of programmers may be able to write code for something. Instagram had 13 people on it and Facebook buys it. So there's elements of which it makes a lot of sense for those companies to be able to engage in. So I think of it too, at least within the industry I'm in, and for a number of the others, it's an external form of R&D essentially. So it's probably safe to say the companies that engage with a fair amount of R&D, probably M&A tends to be a more routine part of what they do. So that's kind of the nature of, I would say, corporate development on a whole, but it definitely varies a lot with the companies that engage with it on a regular basis, in which it's a very normal function that's built out, and there's a playbook for how you run it, and there's a pipeline and a process, versus those that might be a little more opportunistic and happens every now and then, but it's not a regular cadence to how they run their business.
Cool. And just to kind of give a better idea of maybe how it might look in a company, do you usually see this as a giant team, or is the corporate development team generally smaller, or how is it structured off of like an arm of a company?
Yeah, great question. So for team size, it's safe to say they tend to be much smaller teams. So for instance, on my own team, I think it's just 12 of us in the group, and that includes the head of the whole group, 3 directors, and then a few others that are kind of on my more junior associate level within the group there. So tend to be smaller groups on the whole. The way our group too is structured, for what it's worth, it sits under kind of the corporate umbrella, but works with all the different business units within the company. So that's one of the great things about corporate development, is you do get a lot of exposure to the company as a whole. Yeah, but definitely I would say tend to be smaller teams and how they mostly are staffed.
Cool. Yeah, it's a good transition to talking a little bit about your summer experience, which I think a lot of people would be interested in hearing about.
Yeah, definitely. So for my summer experience, probably the first caveats to say, and from my understanding, most MBA interns have kind of an MBA, a designated MBA summer project.
Mhm.
Um, I would take all this to say that there are probably distinctions among whichever company you're in because it's all run differently. But within my own, with corporate development, there wasn't a set MBA project.
Mhm.
So I was staffed as if I were a full-time associate. So there were 5 or 6 different deals or projects I was on through the summer that were in different stages of whether they were on a um, more of a let's look at the strategy and does this make sense kind of early view of the company. There was we're in the diligence phases of do we want to buy this company? And then a few our group also covers just broadly strategic transactions. So whether that's a minority investment or other negotiations. So I had 1 or 2 kind of in that bucket as well.
Interesting.
And this definitely, once again, varies a lot by the company, but there is no corporate strategy group where I'm at. So our group takes on some of those one-off special projects as well. So I got to see one of those last summer too.
Awesome. And
So,
yeah, I mean,
and I'll say too, from just to try to be a little more tangible with some of the experience, it was a lot of modeling work. The role, I guess, to think of it maybe a bit more broadly, is probably fairly similar to a lot of the roles you would do in a banking type of role. So a lot of modeling, it was a lot of managing a deal process. There was legal review, and then working on presentations for the executive committee and the board, and things like that.
awesome. And to kind of bounce off of that, because your experience was for a company that didn't necessarily have like a specific MBA role. When you think about some of maybe your other classmates who did, kind of a corporate development type function, what was their experience, or was it largely similar to yours?
I think so. I don't think that there are a ton of corporate development internships out there. I guess how some of them have varied from what I've heard about. One of the other groups I'd recruited with, I think one was probably more strategy oriented than really corporate development oriented. And then another one was probably much more banking like than I think my role that kind of sits as a bit of a hybrid in between. So it ranges a lot. I know by the cadence in which companies do deals can change the pace of the group a lot to whether it feels slower or whether it feels like things are moving at a pretty good pace. So I know that can be a big difference for an experience within the role too.
Yeah, and I think just to go back to that point, that the corporate strategy and corporate development often have a lot of crossover in what they're dealing with. And a lot of companies have maybe one or not the other, where that function, like, so you guys have corporate development, it also kind of functions as corporate strategy. Some teams have corporate strategy that also functions a little bit as the corporate development. So you see a lot of that with definitely certain companies, and it's all very company specific, which in some ways makes it difficult to figure out exactly what this is going to look like when you have to kind of do some due diligence on every single company you're applying to.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
All right, for people that are watching this and are still super interested and want to learn a little bit more about breaking in, let's talk about at a high level recruiting and kind of starting, at the beginning, what you were doing and moving forward till you get up into the interview.
Yeah, so I think it's probably worth to say that it's important to probably try to understand the groups that you're targeting. So, I mean, to some extent, if certain companies that you're interested in, a lot of it's probably initially getting familiar with the industry, with the company, the kind of deals that they've done, and then also trying to get a sense of the backgrounds that their team has had, because that probably leads a lot to what their recruiting looks more like. And I've seen it from my experience. Some were more consulting oriented, in which it was more case studies. It was the backgrounds fit more that perspective as well. And others were, it wasn't any different than if it were an investment bank in terms of all the questions were technical and everyone had more of that banking background. So I think probably seeing background will probably save yourself some time to know which groups, just based on your own background and experiences, which ones might be a better fit on that. So for my background in banking, I ended up prepping for the interview much more like you would for banking. So I've, in the finance club, had the Breaking into Wall Street guides. I would put a much heavier focus on, making sure you know the financial statements in and out, and then also on the M&A pieces of the materials there too, because that's a really important part for what these groups will tend to ask around and what to think about. But then also too, I think some case interview work, at least a little bit of prep can also be good too, because there will be some groups that structure their interviews much more that direction.
And I want to go back a little bit to the beginning of you creating essentially a company list that you wanted to go target. How did you go about even starting that? Obviously, there's probably some on-campus pieces, so you're going to look at the on-campus companies that might have a role you're interested in. But did you extend that to off-campus and start looking for other companies that you could be interested in as well? And how did you go about determining which companies that would be?
Yeah, honestly, I think some of it came to Googling different companies, corporate development, and trying to see what came up there. Googling corporate development jobs and see what companies had job postings there. I think to some extent it can be LinkedIn and searching MBA intern corporate development and see and not just at Emory, but more broadly, where internships start to pop up. So that helps start to identify them too. I think some of the Google searches sent me to links in which there were job postings for, and was able to apply that way.
Cool.
There were a couple of postings that came within the Goizueta, the Go career search resource. But it definitely, I would say this is a field that probably takes a little bit more sort of self-initiative to really try to find and discover where some of these roles exist.
Yeah.
What I've seen too, to the extent that it's helpful, since these teams tend to be small, a lot of times I think there tends to be a feeder school into a certain corporate development group. And that's kind of what I started to see, which makes it harder to sometimes discover what those are. But to the extent that there are on-campus recruiting, I would definitely take advantage of that. But it's a mix of having to kind of search around and figure out what's out there. It took a little bit of.
And in terms of like the networking piece, because obviously whenever you're talking about off-campus to any degree, that's important. How important did you find that of making sure you connected with somebody at that company and could talk to them and learn a little bit more?
So I guess to think about it in buckets, I know for what I can speak probably to, I know for banking for certain, if you don't do networking, there is no internship. This wasn't in that bucket. So it wasn't would rule you out if you hadn't. I don't think a lot of groups expect to. It feels more like the other corporate roles. However, if there are roads into a company, it definitely helps. Okay,
cool. No, that's good to know. And just one of the other things that we talked about the opportunities, but the timeline. When did you obviously it probably follows the timeline that's kind of generic for most of the positions that people are applying to. But when did you start applying to jobs, or was it kind of over a very, very long period of time? And when did you start interviewing?
Yeah, I started applying, I think so. The role that I'm in came through one of the career conferences that was early in the fall. So
cool.
That went in within it too. I'll say it was unique in how it was positioned, but there is like a broader LDRP program, leadership rotation program. And corporate development is kind of listed as one of the potential opportunity sets out of that. So that's how the first round for mine tends to be a bit more corporate oriented, I would say. Some of the other groups will very much recruit directly, where it'll be the own team, and they don't recruit through the finance leadership development program. It's a direct efforts on their own. So I would say the job applications I ended up doing were anywhere between September to November to apply for that with first round interviews. I did my first one at a career conference, and then most of them were December after that. So
so somewhat of a similar timeline, but probably stretched out over a longer period.
Yes. Yeah.
So cool. And now let's jump a little bit into the interview, which you've talked about a bit. And I think this might be a good time to kind of separate corporate development. A lot of times, as you talked about, either more banking oriented or more strategy. And depending on which of those, the interview is going to mimic the background that they're looking for, the knowledge that they're looking for. So in terms of like preparation, you talked a little bit about the the banking piece, did you have any experience with the consulting piece, or did you basically say, I'm going to stick with the banking background?
I did a little bit of the case interview prep, but
Okay.
not as much as I should have. So I stuck to much more of the banking. I had the flashcards, ran through the breaking into Wall Street interview guides. I mean, went much more that direction, but it definitely varied too, because I went through one set of interviews and it was all technicals the whole way through. And another one for another company, in which the group was more of like the corporate strategy role. It was a little more, much more case studies and really not any sort of banking-esque kind of technical questions.
No, I think that's really good to know, is like, depending on the company, you'll see kind of that divergence. And so depending on what you're trying to do, you prep that side a little bit heavier, but probably being aware of both is beneficial just in case something pops up.
Yeah. And I think there's kind of the ability to, I mean, to some extent, if they're going to ask case interviews, they'll go that route, but to some extent too, I think there can be some, I tried to play to my strengths, I put it that way. So that's why I prepped to make sure that I knew the finance and the banking inside and out. And that's what I was trying to convey, that even though I hadn't done direct M&A, that I understood it, I had the background, and I was capable of doing the job. So.
And in terms of the behavioral side, what did you see with that? How heavy was that kind of pushed on you, or how much did you prep that?
The
Obviously,
banking
prepping
my
is
company,
good.
yeah. That I would say tended to be more, definitely very group specific. And there are probably ways in which you can start to sort of get an idea based on backgrounds of the groups and what discussions are like early on of what that will be like. So I definitely prepped the behavioral. One company, it was 80% of the interview questions were really behavioral, and I was able to make it more conversational with some of the research I'd done on the company and the deals they had done, and be able to talk through. Other ones, it was of a 30-minute interview, there'd be an intro question on a resume walk, and everything else would be, I mean, technical modeling questions. Yeah. So, yeah. So and the other thing that I guess that served myself well in terms of classmates above you who interviewed for these different roles, I mean, that's where you get the most direct feedback in terms of what the culture and what the group's like, and how it's how the interview process, what you should expect from it. So
yeah, so definitely makes sense that any company you're trying to apply to or reach out to, find somebody there just so you can have an idea of what to expect from the interview, because it does sound like it could be literally almost anything.
Yeah.
Cool. And before we get to the closing, I know we had talked previously a little bit about just the importance of background, and I want to make sure people are aware that this is one of the industries that might be looked at a little bit more heavy, but it shouldn't prevent you from trying. So I'd love for you to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, it's definitely one. It once again depends by groups, but if you look across probably the corporate development group within a company, so that would be another point of suggestion, which I had kind of alluded to earlier. But when you start targeting the companies, look and see who's on the team, and I would try to see if you can learn anything about background. That'll definitely help. So I would say that if you had to make a general statement, it probably tends to pull from more of a ex-investment banking kind of background in terms of having had some of the M&A. There are definitely groups that pull from a heavy consulting side too. So I think that's definitely fair, but I'll just, from my own experience, that was something that I kind of constantly, my background gave me enough to get a foot in the door, but it was still something I felt like I had to over prepare for on the technical side to make sure that I could convey that had the capabilities to do the job too. So it depends on the group. Sometimes it's not as limiting as others, but it's definitely something to be prepared to probably address, no matter, unless you've had M&A experience, probably to try to address how you're capable and ready to take on this kind of role.
Absolutely. Yeah, so let's get to the closing. And I have two questions here. First one is, somebody watches this video, they're super excited about corporate development. What would be the next step or two you would recommend somebody to do to learn more and begin to kind of jump into that?
Yeah, so next step, if you're able to identify a number of companies that you're really interested in, doing the deeper dives on them to figure out, I mean, for trying to first figure out, okay, do they even offer MBA internships? But then also the space that they're in, the deals that they're doing, trying to get into the strategy, looking through some of the 10K, watching some of the investor relations videos that come out, that I found really helpful and enabled me to have much more conversations with the people interviewing me, and was my attempt to demonstrate my understanding and willingness to, my understanding of the space, the willingness to learn, and to put in the effort to get up to speed on that side. So that's one. Another would be, I think there's probably maybe I'll lead into it this way. I would say kind of a recommendation in terms of deciding an approach is to figure out, are you more appeal to the consulting side of it, or more appealing to like the M&A deal side of it? And depending on that, I would really recruit for, if Corp Dev's kind of where you want to be, Corp Dev and consulting, or Corp Dev and banking, and target opportunities in both of those, but know that your interview prep is going to be targeted within those lines. And then for a last piece, but just from a tangible point, for the finance questions in particular, the Breaking into Wall Street guide is super helpful. And then I also purchased a Training the Street guide for M&A specifically, which I know for my more technical interviews was kind of a key part that enabled me to move forward with the interviews. So
awesome. And last question for you, which is kind of the fun question, is what closing thoughts or advice do you have for this incoming class? Could be anything, recruiting related, personal, just life advice. It's all good.
Yeah. Let's see. Okay. Well, I'll at least close with the corporate development of saying, like, I do think, even though this isn't as quite as a well-defined path as some of the other roles, I've loved the work. I think it's super interesting. It's been really fun. There's a lot of great exposure and learning, and it's something that I've really enjoyed. So I would try to be honest in terms of setting the expectations of it. It does take work, but from my experience, I think it was worth it. So I would definitely encourage, if it's something that you feel drawn to, that it's something that you really give a good go. Otherwise, though, it's hard not to be too cliche, but the time goes quickly. So I mean, obviously things will look a little different than this fall and the most of it, and I'm sure you're hearing that more than enough, but I would mean that only probably would say that you should really double the effort you put into school and forming these relationships, and let that kind of extra work that you put into of this time period to overcome the kind of challenges that are laid out before. I only think that'll serve you well going forward, and I think it'll be something that it'll make your time a much more rewarding experience at Emory. But I'm excited for you and jealous that you're just starting out on your MBA path. It's I'm sad that mine's over already. It's a great time. So definitely excited for what you have to look forward to.
Yeah, definitely goes quick. And with that is the end of our episode, Corporate Development with Robert. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you, Scott.